Like the other speakers, I'd like to begin by thanking the Dean and Claire for inviting me to this event and for bringing me such a long, long way. In an early and fruitful reaction to my recent student handbook, What is Architectural History?, Carolyn Van Eck responded from the trenches, as she put it, with a series of observations made by students taking her graduate methodology course in the history of art and the history of culture at the University of Leiden. Two observations stand out as having some direct pertinence to our discussions here, so they seem a good place to start. The first of these is that the idea of a discipline of architectural history relies on an intersecting series of claims for autonomy. Put simply, these are the familiar positions that one can separate architecture from the visual arts, can distinguish architectural history, therefore, from the history of art, and can separate the tasks of the historian of architecture from those of the architect. A second observation, though, closely related to the first, is that architectural history is not really history, which is to say that an historical field so heavily populated by interlopers with a professional formation on architecture cannot make any really strong claim upon an historical disciplinarity. It's a matter instead of specialization, or read more cynically, of a credible amateurism, a term we've heard already today. I've worked through some aspects of these claims in my consideration of the positions underpinning Manfredo Tafuri's work as an historian, and on that basis I tend to agree with the underlying criticism leveled by Professor Van Eck's students, that architectural history struggles to operate convincingly as a discipline when the term discipline is understood strictly as a discrete body of knowledge attended by techniques and tools that are its own. Neither, I would say, does almost any historical discipline that worked its way through the theory moment. One key difference, perhaps, between architectural history and the history of letters, say, is that architectural history had not, by the 1970s, firmly established the grounds of its own claims for disciplinarity, and especially in relation to the historical cultures of architecture, historical studies of architecture, rather, conducted within the history of art. Instead, we could witness something of a separation between a scientific architectural history being produced in departments of art history and a theorized and speculative architectural historiography as the domain of the Graduate School of Architecture. This is a caricature, of course, but it may yet serve a purpose. The institutional circumstances of the architectural historian in Australia, I feel some obligation to report on how things are elsewhere, where I've been working for the last 5 years or so, are like those of many countries, but differ markedly from the American situation as I read it. With very few exceptions, architectural history is there located in the professional architecture schools, which prefer to acquire faculty with a professional formation in architecture. Many historians of architecture then are architects by training and historians by specialization, teaching students then who aspire to become architects in the long term. Many historians, too, balance courses in architectural history and architectural theory with classes in architectural design, technology, professional studies, and so forth. These circumstances do not necessarily undermine the capacity of architectural history research, the research conducted in those circumstances, to search out a knowledge for its own sake, but they do serve to actively remind the historian of an audience for his or her work, be it in the lecture hall or in the book or on the bookshelf, other than fellow historians of architecture. We are all fairly familiar with the claims made by Bruno Zevi for an operative history of architecture, and we'll hear more about operativity tomorrow, I gather. Most students following courses in architectural history, he wrote at the beginning of the 1960s, are, with a very few exception, at university to become architects, not historians of architecture. The professor's task, the professor of architectural history's task, then, when teaching within a faculty or school of architecture, is to develop competencies in the student that allow him or her to work with history as a condition of architectural practice, rather than within architectural history as a scientific discipline. Like others of his generation, Zevi taught to reinstate a place for history in architectural culture and for engagement with history to be a kind of architectural practice. This was informed in no mean way by the broader project to recover historical narratives and models from the uses made of them under fascism, and to find in history a tool for the rectification of civilization after the Second World War and the Holocaust. Xavier made no bones in this direction about pressing figures like Michelangelo, Borromini, and Frank Lloyd Wright into service to meet these aims. When Tufuri then was critical of Xavier, he did not attack the wider premises of Xavier's work, except at a rhetorical level. The two agree rather on the fundamental point that attention to architectural history within professional training, as well as in the wider setting of a professional architectural culture, is ultimately to the betterment of architecture and its capacity to operate effectively in architecture's wider settings. It seems that where they begin to come unstuck on this matter is on the extent to which the historian can shape the direction of architectural culture, on the values within architecture that the historian can directly affect. Xavier, as we know, was drawn to form and space as well as to the figure of the architect, how architects in the present can learn from the models left by their better predecessors, and how the architect could lead by example, appealing to such higher measures as civilization. Tufuri, on the other hand, gravitated to the messiness of the processes of procurement, design, and construction, as well as to the exchange between project and reality, two terms with scare quotes, that shapes architectural work both within architecture and without, and the conditions, therefore, of its production. Xavier optimistically has the architect as the figure who can act for the good of society, while Tufuri regards this as a naive goal, given the architect's tendency to work behind a shield of values that isolates architecture from reality. Xavier backed historical narrative, while Tufuri privileged moments of historicity. The two positions are naturally at odds with each other within the premise that historical education and research aids a healthy architectural culture, but they do agree on this fundamental, which is why Tufuri could write to Xavier at the start of the 70s that he considered him as a father, and why Xavier could write in response that he knew as Freud and could see how that was playing out. In fact, when Xavier politely but firmly turned down Giuseppina Rapisada's invitation to preside over a still non-existent foundation, Fondazione Manfredo Tufuri, he cited precisely Tufuri's attacks on the Institute of Venice, where Xavier had given initial form to his instrumental historiography by way of a pedagogically minded research program. Tufuri had altered Xavier's institute to institutionalize his critique of Xavier's positions through his own theory of architectural history's critical relationship with architectural design. This indeed was the institutional corollary to Tufuri's historical project, and a response to Xavier's conception of architectural practice as an architectural project. These positions within the problem of how history can figure in architectural culture are useful to a discussion such as ours because they become extreme in the retelling. It stands to reason that a close reading neither of Tufuri nor Xavier can sustain the characterizations that are necessary for the role that I'm asking them to perform here. Xavier's idea of how history works in architectural culture is that, so I'm going to do them anyway. Xavier's idea is that history is a search for models and heroes that can be recast in the sensibility of the present moment, of any present moment, of a contemporary moment. History, then, offers the security of recurrent solutions to recurrent problems, where both are treated in the abstract and in, as he put it, the key of our own time. And I think we've seen some examples of that more contemporary thinking. Tufuri's idea is that history works to undermine the security that fosters habits based on the false comfort of historical narratives and internal architectural values, internal artistic values. Historical research offers the means to reconnect architecture to a world from which it has become disengaged, partly in terms of historiography, partly through the deployment of historiography. In rejecting Xavier's construction of parallels in the crisis of culture between the Reformation and the Holocaust, classicism and functionalism, Tufuri pitted an instrumental historical project, therefore, against a critical one. And therein we find described two of the basic choices that shape the recurrent form and problems of architectural history as a field of knowledge. This tends to undermine the simplicity of Tufuri's rejection of Xavier's insistence that the architect needs a firm hand to guide him or her through history, instead claiming that architectural historians should do architectural history and architects should know what to do with it. So instead of this, there are a couple of things that I think are wrong with this position. First of all, it assumes a primary readership of architects and students. This is for architectural history, rather than a fellow architectural historians, fellow scientists, as it were. Secondly, it assumes a distinction between these two characters that is undermined by his claims elsewhere that it is the architect who is in the best position to take up history as a vocation. The thief turned security consultant, the insider now working for the other team. But to come back to the criticisms with which I began, they do both work with, do they both work within an historical discipline? And is this the same thing as conducting an historical practice concerning architecture within the borders of a discipline proper? These questions are not only a matter of classification, particularly perhaps for those of us who are still who enjoy turning over the rarefied territory of architecture's intellectual history. The question of utility, of significance, is an inevitable phase of any reporting that we might do to our colleagues in the, within our discipline as we might construct it in the pages of journals, or to our financiers who, by the various mechanisms by which they call us to account for the time that we spend on our work. This concerns the direction of our work, I think. The issue is not whether the historian of architecture is invested in the future, but on what terms. And here is where the still open question of the project remains useful for us, not only for understanding important issues within the history of architectural history, but also to understand the historiological situation in which we now work. That our moment owes a debt to thinking done from the end of the 1960s is perfectly evident from recent books written by a number of our colleagues here. Their timeliness lies in the questions that we're now obliged to address concerning the basic relationships once more between architecture and architectural history theory and criticism, and the history of art, or between those things and the humanities in general, as a broader category. What happens under the banner of architectural history, I want to ask, that doesn't happen elsewhere? Assuming that the architectural historian is already a character subject to a certain degree of conceptual elasticity, the question becomes that of what the historian is for architecture. Not only for the architect as a matter of audience, but also for a broader conception of architecture's long-term premises. In considering this question, many of us are naturally drawn to history to see how this relationship has played out in the past, and this is surely part of our current preoccupation with the history of architectural history. Among the functions we might argue for history, the construction of architecture's historical field within a not necessarily instrumental contemporaneity is, I think, a key one. The traffic between historians and architects has shaped architecture of the last century or so and informed debate on architectural culture, especially since the middle of the 20th century. If that claim has softened in many places, then I think a discussion such as this can be vital not only for clarifying the positions that are available to us as historians of architecture, but also for reviewing the conditions by which historical knowledge enters and engages architectural culture. Thank you.